So welcome to the Durrell Annual Lecture. Now, of course, at this time of year, we would normally be in the Royal Institution in London in their beautiful lecture theatre, and we'd have an audience of about 400 people. But due to COVID-19, we have to do things differently. Now, we're recording the annual lecture tonight in front of a small live audience here in the beautiful butterfly and tortoise habitat at Jersey Zoo. And we're filming it, of course, so we can share it with all of you wherever you are in the world. We would like to say a special thank you to our sponsors of this evening, Rathbones and Rathbone Green Bank, who have been the sponsors for now the third year. I'd like to now introduce a short film from John David, the head of Rathbone Green Bank, to say why they are involved with Durrell and why they're sponsoring this evening.
I'm very sorry not to be with you in person, but this is our third consecutive year of sponsoring Durrell's annual lecture, and I'm delighted that we can continue our support, albeit virtually, on this occasion. I won't reflect on the challenges of 2020 in detail, but suffice to say that uncertainties around the coronavirus pandemic, Brexit, the US election, and much more have been a constant distraction from the need to protect our fragile planet. Yet organisations such as the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust have continued to work hard to provide solutions to help preserve our natural world, and the importance of this work cannot be overstated. Last year, for example, over 500 scientists came together to conduct the most comprehensive study ever completed on the state of the natural world. But terrifyingly, they found that up to 1 million species are currently threatened with extinction. Governments around the world have pledged to build back better and have stated commitments to tackling climate change and creating fairer, greener and more resilient economies. So we question, what role can we play as investors and investment managers in encouraging sustainable economic growth? Biodiversity, and the natural world more generally, provides us all with a wide array of ecosystem services which are crucial to preserving our economy and society. As specialists in ethical, sustainable and impact investment, it has always been critical to us to understand the impact of our portfolio companies on the natural world. With this understanding, we are better able to manage these risks and encourage positive change in corporate behaviour where environmental policies and practices fall short. It is vital for all stakeholders that the preservation of nature is fully integrated into future economic and business models. This belief is central to our investment approach. The work of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust continues to make a real difference to the preservation of our natural world, and we are delighted to continue our support.
The theme of this evening is the power of one, the power that we all have as individuals to act for the planet, and also the power that happens when we come together to effect even more change for good. We're going to see a short film now called The Power of One, featuring the staff of Durrell and why they do what they do.
The power of one is all it takes. One touch to heal the harm, one spark to vanquish the darkness, one whisper to wake a dream, one cause to unite us all. All it takes are the ones who say no to extinction, who get up every day and check the traps, do the maths, question the facts, and map the ground. The ones who check the results, then check the results again, then do the science. The ones who face the problem, then decide what to do about it. The ones who shovel the crap, then sweep up what's left, who heal the cuts and bumps and bruises, then take the blisters, the bites and the fevers, because that's the job. The ones who get up before sunrise to suffer the setbacks and break through the breakthroughs. the ones who paddle, plant, watch, who track, monitor, count, lose count, then count again, who nurture, care and cradle the hopes of tomorrow, the ones who trek for hours into days, strive and drive onwards, searching the forests, jungles and swamps for a sign, then return empty-handed, to sit down somewhere, anywhere, to write a report, then before the day is done, walk into town to join the locals, to hear their troubles and help them find the answers. The ones who are willing to shoulder the responsibility of saving a species and carry that responsibility gladly until the job is done. The ones out there, day after day, no matter what, getting on with it. One person is all it takes. One person to fight one battle until it's won. One species to save 1,000. One love to last a lifetime. One life to make a difference. One day at a time. We are one.
Okay, I think that sets the scene very nicely. Now those lovely velvet Welsh tones that you could hear, that's Carl, who we're going to hear from later. And this talk this evening, it's all about people. So there's going to be a lot about the people who make Durrell. And we think this is quite different for us as a lecture, but we hope you are going to really enjoy this evening. So this is one of my favourite photographs. This is from the annual conference that we have as Durrell staff every year. This is, of course, not this year. This is 2019. And that's just some of the team who make up Durrell. And what we do at that annual conference each year, we try and bring our teams back from around the world. We try and bring as many as possible back here to Jersey. And it's a week where we have meetings, we do workshops, we do planning, we give public talks, we also have lots of parties, very importantly. And it's a wonderful week, and we all incredibly enjoy it because it is that reaffirming as our purpose as a team, all being together. Now, this year, of course, it's not been possible. We had a virtual conference, and it worked very well. But let's be honest, it's not the same. It's not the same, the being together. So we very much hope that we can do that in 2021. But the people that you see in this photograph, they do all kinds of things for Durrell. Some of them work here at the zoo. Some are in our offices in Bath, in the UK. Some are from Madagascar, St. Lucia, Montserrat, Assam. They are from all around the world, and they do all different things for Durrell. And when we think about the people of Durrell, the one thing that they have in common, whether they're working in what we call mission enabling, the people who bring the resources together so we can do conservation, and the mission delivery team, the people who are out delivering that conservation. But one thing they have in common is purpose. We have a strong purpose at Durrell, and we're going to talk a little this evening about how we come to that purpose, and Carl will also talk about that. A little bit in indulgence now. I'm going to talk about how I came to my purpose. So here I am, out where I'm happy, outdoors with animals, and it's raining, but I'm smiling because I'm from Glasgow. And let's face it, if you don't smile when it's raining, you're never going to smile in Glasgow, right? So I'm very happy because I'm out and about. But how did I get here? How did I get to be this person with this purpose? Now, I grew up in Glasgow in the 1970s, and I think for many people this might be the image that they think of Glasgow in the 1970s. It was a more difficult time. We did still have many buildings that were derelict from the Second World War, and there was a lot of poverty. And it was a very hard upbringing for a lot of people, and that probably includes me. But this is also Glasgow. The Gaelic word that Glasgow is derived from means dear green place. And Glasgow has more public parks per capita than any other place in Europe in terms of a city. It is a green place. So despite the fact it was that, harder upbringing, we had this opportunity as kids growing up in Glasgow. And we had ponds to collect sticklebacks and make into our jam jar aquariums. And we had trees to climb. And we also had a real gift. We had freedom to roam. Now, that's something that a lot of kids today have less of. Because I don't know if it's, 1970s parenting, but they were much less concerned about where we went and what we got up to. There was no phones to track us. There was no great concern. So we would go out, and we'd go out for hours with no one knowing what we were doing. And when I say this is the kind of park that I had access to, this is the park I had access to. This is the Victoria Park. It's 50 acres. And there's lots of parks in Glasgow like that. And not only that, you can see my house that I grew up in as a kid in the 70s. Those are very archetypal red sandstone tenement buildings. You can't quite see my house because I lived on the ground floor. But there's a dual carriageway, that big grey thing, that blocked us from getting to the park. So we had to walk along a bit, and there was an underpass, and then we could go in. But we spent so much time of our childhood there. We'd often get locked in at night. We'd have to climb the gates to get out again. But it was a fantastic opportunity. So along with having access to green space and nature and freedom to roam and having pets, it was, in many ways, despite the poverty, an amazing childhood. And the Victoria Park has a really unusual thing in it. There's a building in the corner of the Victoria Park called the Fossil Grove. And I probably first saw it at a time that I can't remember, at 1, 2 years old. And it's a stand of 300 million-year-old fossilised trees. So I spent a childhood, maybe once every week, every 2 weeks, going to look at this and thinking, how can trees be rock? How can that happen? And so it was part of that understanding that the world is really incredible and there's incredible things that can happen. Now, the other benefit I had as a child is that next to the entrance of the park, there was a public library. And I think public libraries are the most wonderful thing. For a kid that couldn't afford books to buy, having access to the public library was amazing. And I would take out as many books as possible, 6 at a time, that's what I was allowed. And then you had the world at your fingertips. You could see the jungles of the world. This was my jungle, but I could see the jungles of the world. I could see the amazing species that I could work with. And I could see what could be different in life. And I also think that people come to purpose in lots of different ways, whatever their purpose is and how they find it. And along with all this freedom to roam and access to nature, I'm a great believer that art helps bring people to purpose, to nature. And when I was 17, there was a Scottish band called Hue and Cry. Maybe some of my contemporaries in this audience might remember them. And when I was 17, they had a song they released called Ordinary Angel. And it meant a lot to me, and still does actually, because it had a line in it that said, I want a life that is bigger than me. I thought, that's what I want. I want a life that's bigger than me. I want a life that will make a difference. So I was starting to find my purpose, how I would come to this. And I knew that I wanted to study zoology. Now, to be honest, I was not a straight A student, and I scraped into university. I was the first person in my family to go to university, and I got into this university, Glasgow University, which is basically the nearest you can get to studying at Hogwarts. Absolutely beautiful place. And that was another revelation of what I could do with my life and the difference that I could hopefully make. Having access to education and training, and tonight we want to launch the Carl Jones Scholarship, which is all about giving access to the important training that young conservationists need. That was a wonder. It was a revelation. And I like this quote from Nelson Mandela: education, the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. And so that was wonderful. I was starting to find what it is that I wanted to do in life. But the next big revelation, when it started to come together, I got a job at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. And I got a job that was solely because I just wanted to work at the Edinburgh Zoo. And so I was the secretary to the curator. But at the weekends, I would volunteer on the animal sections, and I was a gorilla keeper. So when the opportunity came up, I became a full-time keeper. And that was an amazing experience to work with these animals every day. Now, this is actually our gorillas. This is little Amari, 1-year-old, just a couple of weeks ago, absolutely gorgeous. But that taught me a lot as well. The next stage of my discovery of what I wanted to do, what was the purpose of my life. And that was really understanding about the dedication of care that people who work in zoos are putting in. And sometimes it's for incredibly rare species, incredibly vulnerable species, like this little black-lined tamarin that needed a little bit of extra help along the way. And that was a fantastic learning experience, watching the dedication of the people I worked with. And I see it now, today. This is a photograph actually taken by Pierre, who's one of our herpetology keepers. You saw him a moment ago in the film. This is a leaf-tail gecko from Madagascar. Absolutely amazing, amazing species. And the keepers here work with an incredibly diverse group of animals. And what I also learned along the way was that continuum of the work we could do from what we learned in the zoo and how do we apply it to the wild. And Carl will speak about that a little later this evening. So it was all starting to come together in my mind of what I wanted to do and how I would get to here. And that continuum of work, that purpose, goes across the work of Durrell. This is a picture of the Madagascar pochard. Now, about 15 years ago, this species was thought to be extinct. And then a small number were found on a lake, very small number. And Durrell and our partners, we took some eggs and we started breeding pochards, and we built a breeding centre in Madagascar. And in 2018, we released them back into the wild on Lake Sofia in the north. And in 2019, ducklings hatched. Now, that only happened because of the dedication of purpose that our teams have. This was a species that could have been considered to be a no-hoper species, that we couldn't really do anything to save them. But of course, it wasn't true. We could save them. Now, they're not out of the woods yet, but we are making progress. And that dedication has really made all the difference. And that dedication extends to everything we do. Now, in Madagascar, we also work very closely with local communities. And at the end of last year, a cyclone system devastated the communities that we work in. Now, these are people who don't have very much to begin with. They have quite challenging lives at the best of times, but you can see what happens if a cyclone goes through their communities. But our teams work very closely with local communities. This is the people they see every day, so of course we wanted to act quickly. And this is Richard, who is the head of our programme in Madagascar. Now, Richard is dedicated to Madagascar. It is where he lives, it is his home, and has been for many, many years. And so we wanted to galvanise our team very quickly, bring that same purpose and dedication that we put into species conservation and make sure we help the people whose communities we work in. And this was also made possible through Jersey Overseas Aid, who provided emergency grant funding. And it meant that we were one of the first NGOs to respond to this cyclone and try and help the local community. Because conservation does not work in isolation. Conservation's got to be in the context of the people that we live and work amongst. This is me happy again. Very happy because I'm holding a tiny tortoise. Now, I'm very lucky as a CEO of Durrell that I get to do some amazing things and go to amazing places. And this is on a very small offshore island of Mauritius called Îles Aigrettes. And again, Carl will talk about Îles Aigrettes, a place we've worked for a long time. And I'm holding up this tiny Aldabran tortoise and really excited because it's going to be the last time I can really hold up a tortoise that will then become this. So they become very big animals, and they're quite important animals for Durrell as well in the wild. But I put this photograph in because I want to talk about Nick. Nick is the head of our programme in Mauritius. Again, he's made it his home. He's applying for citizenship. It is the place he's going to live the rest of his life. And he's absolutely dedicated to the conservation of species in Mauritius. And that dedication really came to the fore recently. This is a Telfair skink. If anyone's been to the reptile house of Jersey Zoo, you will recognise that. And this was taken on Round Island, another island to the north. It's a slightly unusual picture. You think, what are you looking at? That's a wild Telfair skink sitting on my lap, because these are really bold and brave little creatures. But this species is only doing as well as it is now because of Nick and the team. This was a species that was disappearing. And it's through the dedication of Nick that this is actually now beginning to recover, this little species. Recovers so much that at the field station on the island, they often hang out and see what the people are doing and jump on you, etc. And Nick's dedication to the island was certainly tested earlier this year. You'll know about the massive oil spill that happened off the coast when a tanker crashed and broke in half on the reef. The reef is right next to that first island I talked about, Île Sagrette. You know, I stayed at Nick's house, and when you're trying to get to sleep at night, you can hear the reef. It's incredibly loud. That's how close it is to the shore. And so it's pretty devastating when that happened. And I'm going to show you a very short clip of a film so you can get a sense of that from Nick.
Having this ship crash right on our doorstep is very upsetting. It's very difficult to comprehend, but we've just had to move and take action. And this triggered this emergency rescue of the threatened reptiles that exist on the Southeast Islands. Being on these islands for a couple of hours, it gets a little bit unbearable. It burns your eyes, your nose and your mouth, so this is a risk. So
that's a very tiny clip. There's a much longer film that if you go on our YouTube channel, you can see. It really talks about the rescue mission. And this is a good example of lots of people coming together, and not just at Durrell. We only had the opportunity to make this film because of the ports of Jersey making this filming possible. So thank you very much to Matt and his team who's here this evening. That film will show you what was really devastating, how quickly we had to act. But essentially, 3 species of endangered reptile were at risk. And it was a species called the Bossier skink, the Bouton skink, and this little one you can see in the middle, the night gecko. If we didn't act quickly, they live on other little offshore islands. We were already seeing oil contamination. And basically Nick sounded the alarm and said, we have to act now. We have to act. And in very typical Durrell fashion, we didn't have the budget, but we thought, well, we're doing it anyway. We'll find the money in some way. And thankfully, we've had some very generous sponsors who've stepped in and really helped make this rescue happen. But it was also across the whole trust, from Nick and the team in Mauritius to Matt and his team here in the Reptile House, to Alex and her team with the communications and fundraising, just across the piece. We were all very galvanised, and our purpose at that point was very clear: rescue these species before it's too late. And there was quite a few obstacles in the way, but we did manage to do it. Now, I think you've probably never seen anyone gaze so lovingly at a frog, apart from maybe Miss Piggy and Kermit. But this is Luke, who works for us in Montserrat. And Luke is the person in charge of our mountain chicken project. So that frog is a mountain chicken, and it's one of the rarest frogs in the world. And it's Luke's purpose to save this species from extinction. And throughout COVID, he's been working, he's got special dispensation to still work on Montserrat, to do what he needs to do to try and keep the programme going there. And this is another species that was facing huge threats. It's found on 2 islands, Montserrat and Dominica. It had entirely disappeared from Montserrat. It's threatened by habitat loss, the chytrid fungus, which is devastating to amphibians. And last year, at the end of last year, after having bred them here at Jersey Zoo, we began to return them to the wild. And that was a very emotional moment for a number of our staff that we work with on Montserrat, because this is an important species for the people of Montserrat. And they hadn't heard mountain chickens calling in the night for years because they hadn't been there. So there was quite a few tears that evening, I think, because it was such a special event. And we need people who feel that purpose for all kinds of species, not just the big glamorous species, but for every kind of animal that you can find. And these three characters are also Durrell staff, all having purpose to the limits. So that's Dan, Drittaman, and Parag. And then in this image, they're in Assam in India. And we run the pygmy hog program there. So the pygmy hog, the smallest pig in the world, really tiny. Now, Drittaman and Parag are based in Assam and they work on the program. Dan is actually the volunteer manager here at the zoo. But he is so passionate about pygmy hogs that he took it upon himself to make a film about pygmy hogs called The Underhogs, because they're the underdogs of the pig world. And he translated that passion. He thought, how can I help? I'm going to make a film to talk about the pygmy hogs and make sure as many people as possible know all about them. And we just saw Luke gazing at a frog. This is Parag gazing at his life's work. Because Parag has been working on our pygmy hog program for years. And it truly is his purpose to save this species from extinction. That is his purpose in life. And thanks to Parag and the team, this has gone from being the rarest pig in the world to not having that unhappy title anymore. It's still rare, but it's just a lot better now than it was. But that purpose has to continue. We need dedication for years, because right now in Assam, not only are they facing COVID, but there is an outbreak of African swine fever. That could be devastating for this program. If it gets into the breeding centres, then we'll probably lose all the pigs. So we've come so far, but we can't stop. We need to keep going, and we need people like Parag, who's absolutely dedicated to the cause. And we're releasing pygmy hogs into the wild. We've released over 116. And we're establishing new territories in places like the Manas National Park. But it also means we're protecting the grasslands of India. Very unique habitats, very important for species and things like carbon sequestration. It's people like Parag with that purpose who make a real difference. Back at the zoo, there's a different kind of dedication. That dedication to clean up every day, that dedication to be out in all kinds of weathers. And this is Georgia, one of our young mammal keepers. She works with the bears and the macaques and the howlers. And this is Safi the howler, a bit of a social media star, very engaging monkey. And they truly dedicate their lives to working with these animals. They think about them, they have cameras on their phones to watch them when they're not here, all kinds of things. So they are really, really dedicated to the cause. And we talked earlier about mission enabling and mission delivery. Here's some of our mission enabling staff from the catering department, from hospitality. Now, they're not making food for humans there, they're making food for the animals. Because during COVID, of course, we had no humans at the zoo when we had lockdown. And our older volunteers are often the people who help us with food prep. But we had to be really mindful of making sure they were shielding at the early part of the pandemic. So we had to say that they couldn't come and help us at the zoo, which was very sad. But then what we did is our catering team stepped in and applied their purpose to then looking after the animals. They also did maintenance of habitats. They looked in the gardens. So they kept their purpose. Because we like to think that across the whole of Durrell, they are contributing to our mission in all kinds of different ways. And this is Zoe. I don't know if Zoe's at the back, and I don't know if she knows I had this picture in. I first met Zoe in 2016, and she was not a member of the Durrell staff, and she was organising a fundraising ball because she wanted to raise money for Durrell. That was the Rainforest Ball in 2016. But it became perfectly apparent that this was a person who was what we like to call Team Durrell. So we hired her immediately afterwards. We thought, we need this person with her skill sets and her dedication. Zoe's mad about orangutans, and that's what she wanted to raise money for. And she applies that every day at work as well. So that's a bit about some of the people of Team Durrell and how we think about what we do, our purpose in life. And I've put it into an equation. I thought, you know, we're a science organisation. I'm sure there's an equation for this. So I've decided it's this. It's mission enabling plus mission delivery plus passion times lots and lots of enthusiasm. And that equals Team Durrell to the power of us all. I'm sure I can get one of the scientists to work it up properly. So that's our common purpose. But how do we make conservation of the natural world all our common purpose? Because it's going to take a lot more than individual organisations like Durrell. It's going to take a lot more than all the conservation organisations in the world. There is so much to do. But actually this year, I think, is going to be beneficial in the long run. Because we have found a common purpose this year. How do we defeat this tiny piece of biodiversity that was in the wrong place? I think it's important to remember this. This is just an inert little piece of nature, but we humans put it in the wrong place. And we have to be incredibly mindful that we can't keep doing that. But the other thing that we've learned this year is if we are faced with something that seems like an enormous challenge, if we put the right resources into it, if we put our expertise as humans, and yes, it's been an imperfect response because we are humans, but look at what we've been able to do already. We're not through this yet, but I have confidence we're going to be. Just in the past week, the 2 vaccines that have shown to have over 90% efficacy, that is an amazing piece of scientific endeavour. That's what we can do as a planet when we really want to deal with a problem. And we're seeing a younger generation which is rightfully becoming very fed up with us. They are rightfully becoming angry that we are not putting the right resources in. That young man there was at a demonstration in Dublin. I like that sign. And why did it take a 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirl to really make governments and set up and think about climate change? That doesn't reflect well on us, the adults, I have to say. But thank goodness that the young people are finding their voice and wanting to be heard. And I think we have a younger generation who really want purpose in their lives. Now, we heard earlier this evening from John David, the head of Rathbone Greenbank. I also think, you know, we're here on Jersey. This is a financial centre. And we're seeing some great movement in the financial services industry in thinking about this, thinking about purpose and thinking about how financial services can be changed for the good to make sure that investments become part of the armoury to change how we treat biodiversity, to think about dealing with climate change. And I think the really clever corporations and companies in the world already know that if we don't change, we're essentially cutting off the branch that we sit on. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to see some really powerful change with those large organisations. And if the money markets of the world wish to, they would make a huge difference to biodiversity conservation. And I have hope that that's going to happen. So it's really about this jigsaw puzzle. How do we bring this purpose together? I know for individuals it often seems somewhat hopeless. How can me recycling my bottles, how can me planting a tree, how can I do something as an individual? And I think we have to remind ourselves we're not just individuals. There's 7.5 billion of us. So that's part of the problem, but it's also a really powerful part of the solution. It's not about us all being perfect, but it's about us all being better and being part of that jigsaw puzzle. And I think sometimes we feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, but it's trying to find that purpose that we can do things. And once we put it all together, it's huge. And put it all together, we must. I like this cartoon. It's been altered a few times over the years, but I think it really does tell the tale of what we are facing. So we're dealing with COVID and we're making progress. And then we'll have to think about what happens in terms of a global recession and how do we deal with that. But the really big existential threats that we're facing are climate change and biodiversity collapse. And we're not yet seeing enough urgency. But if we took the urgency with which we approached the problem of COVID to these two bigger problems, think of what we could do. So this is the real jigsaw puzzle. It's not the simple one of us as individuals. It's about how it all fits together in which, on this canvas, our home. This is our home. So this is where we need to put everything together, where we need to impress upon our governments that they need to act with the same urgency, that they need to act with the same level of resources or far greater than they've applied to COVID. Because it's a jigsaw puzzle, but we know many of the parts already. We know how to do it. That's our common purpose, I believe, as humanity. That's our common purpose that we could all play a part in, no matter what we do. So I'm going to end on this slide. I took this little image on Round Island off the north coast of Mauritius. And it was a great trip to see what we're doing there. Round Island is like our Jurassic Park. We're trying to recreate a whole ecosystem from scratch because the island was so devastated. And at the end of the evening, we would sit on a little cliff area, maybe have a whiskey or two, and it was easy to think that we might be the only people in the world looking out on the Indian Ocean on this tiny island. The birds would all be coming into roost and calling in the night. But of course, we're not the only people, not even when we're on a tiny island in the Indian Ocean. So I'm going to end with one of my favourite quotes from the anthropologist Margaret Mead. And she said, "Never forget that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So imagine if it's not just a small group. Imagine if it's all of us. Now we're going to hear from Professor Carl Jones, the Chief Scientist of Durrell, about his 40-year career saving species from extinction, working with Durrell. Now, Carl is also the recipient of the 2016 Indianapolis Prize, and that is essentially the Nobel Prize of Conservation, something he richly deserves. So let's hear from Carl now.
Gerard Durrell was a great conservationist, but he was a lot more than that because he had the ability to inspire us through his writings. And like many young children, I was hugely enthralled by the stories he told about animals. And like many young children, I kept animals in my back garden. I started off with rabbits and guinea pigs. But as I grew older, I started to keep some waifs and strays, some wild animals. And I used to keep injured birds and orphaned birds that I used to look after. And one day I was in school and I went to a very old school with wonderful old stone buildings, and under the eaves jackdaws used to nest. And in the spring some of the young used to fall out of the nest prematurely, and I used to gather up these young jackdaws and take them home and rear them. And one day in between classes I climbed over the fence into the headmaster's garden to look for jackdaws that were in the rhododendron bush, some baby jackdaws. And I was scrabbling around in the bush, and the headmaster came up behind me and he said, "Jones, what do you think you're doing? And I said, oh, sir, I'm looking for baby jackdaws. Jackdaws? What are you looking for baby jackdaws for? He said. And so I explained that I wanted to rescue them and take them home and rear them. And I wanted to learn how to keep birds in captivity so that one day I could work with very rare species and perhaps save them from extinction. And I told him that I'd like to travel the world and work with the world's most endangered species and save them by captive breeding and reintroduction. He shook his head and he looked at me and he said, Jones, don't be so stupid. To be able to do that, you either have to be wealthy or intelligent, and you are neither. Anyway, that was what my headmaster thought of me, and although I wasn't particularly good in school, I did pursue my interest in natural history, and I did develop a number of skills keeping animals in my back garden. And I reared lots of injured birds, and I was very successful that I was able to breed European kestrels. And I bred these in my garden, and I thought to myself, wow, wouldn't it be great if I could apply these techniques that I'm learning to conservation? And then a few years later, I heard about the plight of the Mauritius kestrel. It was the world's rarest bird. It had declined to just a handful of birds in the wild, and at one stage there was only 4 known individuals and 1 breeding pair. And I thought to myself, these techniques, these skills that I've learned in my back garden can be used to save the world's rarest bird. And so I made some inquiries and I got to know various people, and I said, I want to go to Mauritius. I want to go and work on the Mauritius kestrel and the other rare birds there. And after I'd been there a year or so, I realised that Gerald Durrell was very interested in Mauritius and the rare animals there, and I met Gerald Durrell. And Gerald Durrell said to me, Carl, you're not going to leave Mauritius. We want to keep you there, and we are going to find you the money to carry on that project. And I was totally inspired. The international organisations that had sent me to Mauritius had basically said this was a hopeless situation. And here was Jerry, who believed that we could do something. And he also believed in me. And I remember him telling me, Carl, you can really save those species. We know how to breed species in captivity, and we can learn how to put them back in the wild. And he inspired me. He showed me that individuals can make a difference. As the years went by, we learned to look after Mauritian wildlife in captivity and to breed them. And we thought about it and we realised that, okay, some of the problems that caused the great rarity of the pigeon and the kestrel still persisted, but we could mitigate those by applying captive breeding techniques in the field. So we started to work with the echo parakeet, which was at the time the world's rarest parrot. We brought some of those into captivity and were successful in breeding those. And then we started to put those back into the wild. But again, there wasn't enough food for them, so we started to feed those and provide them with nest boxes. And so essentially we were applying zoo techniques to free living populations. But of course, it's not really very practical to do this long term. And this became a driver for starting to restore the habitat. And we thought, well, there's been 500 years of environmental neglect. How can we actually correct that? So by managing our animals, we could get the numbers up. And then we started to tinker with the environment. What can we do to exclude cats? What can we do to frighten away monkeys? How can we actually feed the animals more effectively? And how can we start restoring the forest? So very small steps, we started to rebuild the environment. And one day I had a message from the Prime Minister's office. the Prime Minister and his cabinet wanted to see a Mauritius kestrel. So one weekend, the whole cabinet and their families turned up. I showed them around the captive breeding centre. I showed them the captive animals. I told them about the work that we do at Durrell and how we were working with the government of Mauritius trying to restore these rare species. And then I took them up into the Black River Gorges. And I got the Prime Minister to hold up a white mouse in his hand, and the kestrel came and took it. And the Prime Minister was thrilled. And the whole cabinet thought it was a wonderful day. And then a few years later, we said that what we really needed in Mauritius was a national park. That we had saved some of the rare species. We'd saved the Mauritius kestrel and the pink pigeon by captive breeding. And when they were debating in Parliament whether they should have a national park, the Prime Minister stood up and he talked about going into the Black River Gorges and seeing the kestrel and the other birds, and how, because we had now saved the rare birds, we needed somewhere for them to live. And so I like to think that it was that trip up into the Black River Gorges with the Prime Minister that actually was the main driver for restoring part of Mauritius and setting up the national park. The idea was that we should perhaps take these islands and see whether we could turn them back into something approaching their original form with the original plants and animals. We started with Round Island, and we also started working on another smaller island called Îles Aigrettes, which was much closer to the mainland, where we could do a lot of our experimenting. And it was onto Îles Aigrettes that we introduced pink pigeons, and they did really well there. It was on Îles Aigrettes where we started to rebuild some of the coastal forest and starting to think about how we can take the different elements, the different species, and rebuild a system that functions again. And then we realized that there were missing elements. Some species had gone forever. The dodo had disappeared in 1662. We can never bring it back. But also many other species had disappeared. And I kept thinking at the back of my mind, what impact did those other species have? How did they fit into the ecosystem? And I read the early accounts. I read early Dutch accounts, and I read lots of documents on the history of Mauritius. And one day I had the idea that we could bring back another species of tortoise to fulfill the role that was once filled by the extinct Mauritian tortoises. And it was on Îles Aigrettes that we did the first introductions of Aldabra tortoises. And you know, it was amazing because we introduced those animals and they started to graze on lots of the weedy plants, started to open up areas, and we started to see the regeneration of the native ebony trees. Trees that hadn't been regenerating for decades, if not centuries. We started to find youngsters. And it was because the tortoises were eating the fruits and spreading the seeds. And so we could see that they were providing a very important ecological function. And after our experiments on Îles Aigrettes, we released some of these giant tortoises on Round Island. That was nearly 2 decades ago. And we now have nearly 600 tortoises on Round Island. In fact, we have more than 600 tortoises on Round Island. And they are starting to restore the native vegetation. They're maintaining open areas with what is called a grazing climax community of small little plants, found nowhere else in the world except Mauritius. And they're spreading the seeds of some of the native palms and screw pines. When we started, we were working with a few very rare species, trying to save them using captive breeding and intensive management in the wild. We saved those. We then moved on to protecting habitats. and now rebuilding whole ecosystems. So Durrell has moved from species through to systems. We will always, of course, be species focused, but I think this work illustrates and shows very strongly that species can be a very good driver for restoring a whole system. And it was Jerry Durrell that always said that most, if not all, species are savable. But what's even more powerful than that is you can save species and also save the systems in which they are found. Species work can drive the restoration of whole ecosystems. And when I look back on all that species work that we did, what is really encouraging is that a very large percentage of those people that came to work with me have gone on to achieve great things. The work that they did in Mauritius has given them a sort of stepping stone to a bigger career working in conservation. And that fills me with great joy, although I look back and I love thinking about the kestrels and the pigeons and the parrots. I get almost as much satisfaction from thinking about the people that have been trained in Mauritius and the difference they've made. There are many challenges of climate change, problems of diseases spreading around the world. In recent years, we've seen several pandemics: COVID, SARS, Ebola, and AIDS. These problems have all manifested themselves because we've abused nature. Massive deforestation, exploitation of animals, viruses jumping from animals to man. But there are answers. If we look at Durrell has probably saved from extinction more species of animals than any other organisation on this planet. Now just think of that for a moment. If we look at those species that would probably have disappeared without conservation, Durrell can honestly say that he's been involved in saving around 20% of that number. So Durrell has the answers. We've already seen we can save species. Most, if not all, species are savable. And by working with species, we can also drive the restoration of habitats. We can restore habitats and rebuild ecosystems. Durrell is probably one of the most effective conservation organisations on this planet. And together we can develop Durrell's dream of making the world a wilder, healthier and more colourful place.
And now we're going to hear two people to talk a bit more about Carl and what his work has meant in the world of conservation. First up, we're going to hear from Dr. Lee Durrell, the Honorary Director of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. And then we're crossing to America to hear from Dr. Rob Shoemaker, the President and CEO of the Indianapolis Zoo, about how Carl has inspired so many others in conservation.
I think the conservation community, and the world for that matter, need people like Carl Jones, because Carl actually thinks out of the box and comes up with really amazing solutions to problems. And as well as that, he has a long-term vision. And I'm not talking, 4 or 5 years or even 10 years, but Carl thinks in decades. I mean, he has a 100-year vision, and that's something that we really desperately need in conservation. Jerry was very taken with Carl for many, many reasons. Another thing that Jerry admired very much in Carl is his tenacity, that he just wouldn't give up on things. Maybe the most important thing was that Carl, like Jerry, was a champion of what we call the little brown jobs. That is, the little creatures, the animals that are you know, not big sexy box office creatures like tigers and elephants and such, but he was a real champion for the smaller creatures, various small birds. 40 years ago, when Carl started out, he was considered a real maverick. You know, his championing of some of the, particularly the Mauritius kestrel, I'm thinking of, people said, "Oh, why are you doing that? It's just a lost cause, just give it up." But today, he's been proven right. Carl is a great inspiration to a lot of people because I think because he thinks about things very deeply. He actually takes the time to ponder things, come up with solutions, and once he does, he then takes the ball and runs with it and gets the job done. He doesn't stop till he succeeds, and to my mind, that's a huge inspiration.
Carl just has remarkable courage, talent, and vision for making the world better for wildlife and preserving natural ecosystems. And a great example, species like great green macaws that we have a commitment to at the Indianapolis Zoo, and we absolutely are passionate about Carl's devotion to preserving them in the wild. We really love the fact that Carl is training young Mauritians to build on his legacy and help preserve wildlife for future generations. When I think about the influence that Carl has had internationally on conservation, I know there's at least one or two things that come to mind immediately that are so significant. And the first is the level of innovation that he has brought to developing programs that can be applied anywhere around the world. The other, of course, is combining captive breeding and reintroduction with those innovative programs to apply to species that otherwise may have absolutely no hope. I think it's unbelievably wonderful to be able to say that Carl Jones has been personally responsible for saving 9 species that were on the brink of extinction.
Now tonight we are launching the Carl Jones Scholarship, named in honour of Carl and all that he has done to inspire the next generation. Essentially, what we want to do via the scholarship is make the next generation of Carls to help save this amazing planet. These scholarships will be available to conservationists from really important biodiversity areas of the world to really give them the ability to do additional training and to learn the skills that they need to do the best they can at saving nature. This scholarship has 2 parts. For 12 weeks they will come here to Durrell in Jersey and take part in the Desmond course, the Durrell Endangered Species Management course. And they'll learn all kinds of skills over a 3-month period. But it doesn't stop then. We then mentor them for the next 2 years to give them the real skills that they need, empower them to save nature. We're now going to hear from 2 young conservationists who've both benefited from Durrell training, Diogo in Brazil and Vanusha in Mauritius. And in fact, Vanusha is our first ever Carl Jones Scholar.
My name is Diogo. I'm a vet, and today I'm working in a Conservation and Research Institute in Brazil, in the Amazon.
Hi, my name is Vanusha. I'm from Mauritius. I am currently working on the Eco-Parakeet project as a senior field staff. I joined the Mauritian Wildlife in January 2018, working on the Pink Pigeon project, and I'm moving on to the Eco-Parakeet project in October 2018.
And we are trying to do our best to avoid that endangered species suffer and just disappear.
As a conservationist practitioner, I am only within the first 6 months of receiving my scholarship, and as I have learned so much on the Desmond course and how I see the positive effect it made on my work after coming back here in Mauritius. This scholarship gives me the real feel that you can be successful in your career, as well as the motivational support working in the conservation world, and I have access to these resources now.
Everything that I've learned everything that I saw, all the networking, all the knowledge, all that was amazing. So I have no doubt that Durrell Wildlife Trust makes all the difference in my life and in my job here in Amazon.
The scholarship will really evolve my career. It's not just about preserving biodiversity, but also to develop my role, share my knowledge, train and motivate.
We are trying to do something to avoid that endangered species go to extinction, and all the knowledge, all the networking, all the information, everything.
I appreciate him not just as a scientific director, but also as a person, and also all the people who supported me to get where I am right now. And so as the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, the Desmond course, and everybody who actually really helped me.
Thank you so much, Durrell, and let's do our part, okay? Cheers.
So thank you.
Now, thanks of course to the wonder of technology, wherever you are in the world, you can ask a question. So if you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat function and we'll do our best to answer it. So thank you for tuning in this evening to the Durrell Annual Lecture, all about the power of one. We hope you feel inspired to do more for nature, and we hope you feel inspired about the work of Carl and the Carl Jones Scholarship. If you'd like to know more, you can go to the Durrell website and find out how you can help create the next generation of conservation leaders. We hope you're going to help us do that, so please do get in touch.